Hello again, and welcome back to part two of Jefferson's salute to Abraham Lincoln. I'm Thomas Watson, and this is my travel companion and star of the show, Thomas Jefferson. In the first part of our tribute to President Lincoln, we took you on a journey from Abe's humble birth all the way to his first inauguration. This episode will begin at the Capitol for Abraham Lincoln's inauguration and take you through the rest of his life, a life he gave to help preserve our nation. So please sit back, grab some theater popcorn, and enjoy the show. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the east portico of the United States Capitol where he recited the presidential oath of office. With his new whiskers, thanks to Grace Bedell, Lincoln became the first president to sport any facial hair other than sideburns. Inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, March 4th, 1861. The threat of civil war was rampant before Abraham Lincoln moved into the executive mansion, and it became real when he became president. On April 12, 1861, when Lincoln sent much needed supplies and reinforcements to Fort Sumter, Confederate troops fired upon the fort. This was an act of war. When Lincoln became president, 7 states had already seceded from the Union. On April 17th, Virginia became the 8th state to join the Confederacy. They were followed by Arkansas on May 6th, North Carolina on May 20th, and the 11th and final state to join the Confederacy was Tennessee on June 8th, 1861. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. This cannon I'm posing on was situated on the battlefield where the first Battle of Bull Run was fought on July 21st, 1861. I'm standing in the Bull Run River, near the stone bridge where a major portion of the 2-hour-long Battle of Bull Run took place. The Battle of Bull Run, which was won by the Confederacy, was the first major battle of the Civil War. Ten months into the Civil War, tragedy struck the Lincolns on February 20th, 1862, when their 11-year-old son Willie died from typhoid fever. Willie Lincoln's death in the Prince of Wales room, February 20th, 1862. Following Willie's death in the Prince of Wales room, the child's body was embalmed in the green room of the executive mansion, which is where I'm standing in this image. The building behind me is known today as President Lincoln's Cottage at Old Soldiers' Home. The historic home is located a little over 4 miles north of the White House and served as Lincoln's summer White House during his administration. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln was in residence at this house when he wrote the primary text of the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. In a 2-year span, from 1862 to 1864, Lincoln spent 14 months living in this house. The president's last visit came on April 13th, 1865. Two major Union victories in July 1863 helped turn the tide of the Civil War. On July 3rd, General George Meade's troops defeated Robert E. Lee's Confederate soldiers during the three-day Battle of Gettysburg. I'm posing in Devil's Den on the Gettysburg battlefield. While only 329 Confederates were killed in this area on July 2nd, 1863, one soldier in particular was photographed where I'm lying. I'm standing on a cannon at the site of Pickett's charge, where 1,123 Confederate soldiers were killed in the fields behind me on July 3rd, 1863. On July 4th, 1863, Union forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant defeated General John C. Pemberton's Confederate Army during the siege of Vicksburg. The entire siege lasted for 47 days, with 3,202 Confederates losing their lives and nearly 30,000 soldiers surrendering. It was on this hilly field where I'm standing when the 8th Battery of Michigan Light Artillery fired continuously on enemy troops during the entire battle. The monument in the background is the 62-foot tall Illinois Memorial, which was dedicated on the site on October 26, 1906. At 6 p.m. on November 18, 1863, President Lincoln arrived by train at the Gettysburg Railroad station behind me. After his arrival, Lincoln was escorted to the home of David Wills, where he spent the night. The three-story brick home behind me was owned by 32-year-old attorney David Wills when President Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg. Wills had purchased 17 acres of land for a cemetery to honor the Union dead from the July battle. Lincoln was invited to offer a few appropriate remarks during the cemetery's dedication ceremony. Late in the evening of November 18, 1863, President Lincoln penned the final draft of his dedication speech in his second-floor bedroom on the far right of this image. At some point on the morning of November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln walked out of the door behind me, mounted a horse, and headed off to help dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery. This is the Lincoln Address Memorial, erected in 1912 in the National Cemetery. Most people believe this was the location of Abraham Lincoln's historic Gettysburg Address, but it wasn't. Extensive research by historians have placed the speaker's stand for the dedication ceremony to have been at this site inside Evergreen Cemetery. It's believed Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address between three headstones: George Kitzmiller in front of me to my left, John Koch behind and left of me, and Israel Yount to my immediate right. The base of the Soldiers' National Monument can be seen through the trees and beyond the fence inside the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Following the 2-hour oration by Edward Everett of Massachusetts, President Abraham Lincoln stood up to offer his few dedicatory remarks. The president's historic speech began with, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Lincoln's historic address ended with, "This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's 271-word speech was 10 sentences in length and took roughly 2 minutes to deliver. While the Civil War occupied most of Lincoln's time, he did help pass the Homestead Act in 1862, and 2 new states joined the Union in its first term. Those states were West Virginia in 1863, which agreed to Congress's demand they abolish slavery and enter as a free state, and Nevada joined the Union in 1864. By the end of Lincoln's first term, a total of 36 states comprised our nation, and that was including the states who left to join the Confederacy. While Lincoln discussed his strategy near the end of the Civil War, it appeared not all of his cabinet were on the same page. President Abraham Lincoln had no problem being reelected during the 1864 presidential election when he defeated Democrat George B. McClellan 212 to 21 in electoral votes. On March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln recited the oath of office on the east portico of the United States Capitol. This was the first inauguration to feature African Americans in the inaugural parade. During the inauguration, there was something more sinister lurking on the upper enclosed platform above the president. One of America's most famous and well-known actors was watching and waiting. The actor was John Wilkes Booth, and he knew his greatest performance was about to make national headlines. Inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, March 4th, 1865. The 3-story gray stuccoed mansion behind me was built in 1818 and served as the home of Confederate President Jefferson Davis from August 1861 until he evacuated Richmond on April 2nd, 1865. At 9 a.m. on April 4th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln arrived at this house only 2 days after the Confederate president had vacated it. Lincoln walked through the first floor of the building, but he refused to venture to the upper floors. While posing near the east portico of the Confederate White House, I envisioned an unsupervised Joseph Davis, the president's 5-year-old son, as he tightrope walked on the hand railing of the porch before accidentally falling to the brick patio below on April 30th, 1864. The youngster passed away from his injuries just as his parents arrived home. Some say Jefferson Davis never recovered from the loss of his son. Lincoln insisted that it was improper for a man to visit the private rooms of another man's house. Instead, the president met with military officials and other dignitaries for about 3 hours in this front parlor. When President Lincoln and his son Tad walked into the house, the humble leader removed his hat, sat in a chair, and crossed his long legs. Abe was somewhat exhausted from his 2-mile walk from Admiral Porter's flagship, Malvern. Before he met with others, Lincoln drank some tea as he absorbed the momentous occasion. I'm standing on the front porch of the home once owned by Wilmer McLean and his wife Virginia. The 2-story wooden structure was built in 1848 and became famous at the end of the American Civil War. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee walked up onto this porch, through the door behind me, and into the front parlor where he waited for General Ulysses S. Grant to arrive. Once Grant arrived in his mud-spattered uniform, he sat at the wooden table to the right. Lee was dressed in a ceremonial uniform and sat at the marble table behind me. At 1 p.m. on Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, Generals Lee and Grant signed the surrender papers in this room. The long and bloody national nightmare was over. The horrors of the Civil War took its toll on President Lincoln. After all, 365,000 Union soldiers were killed and 282,000 were wounded. Approximately 258,000 Confederate soldiers lost their lives in the war as well. 2 days after the Civil War officially ended, President Lincoln had a dream where he wandered the executive mansion in search of mournful sounds. When he got to the East Room, he saw a catafalque bearing a coffin. Soldiers surrounded the casket, while others were crying. In the dream, Lincoln asked a soldier, "Who is dead in the White House?" "The president," was the answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Later, Lincoln told his bodyguard, "In this dream, it was not me, but some other fellow that was killed." On the morning of Good Friday, April 14, 1865, President Lincoln woke in a pleasant mood. The morning papers carried the announcement that the president and his wife would be attending the theater that evening. At one point, Mary developed a headache and was inclined to stay home, but Lincoln told her they must attend because newspapers had announced that he would. The slippers behind me were worn by Abraham Lincoln on the morning of April 14, 1865. The president used this spoon at dinner in the executive mansion before he and the First Lady left for the theater. After they picked up their invited guests, Miss Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone, the Lincolns arrived at Ford's Theater at 8:30 p.m. The play, Our American Cousin, was already in progress. The presidential party was led through the door to my left and up to the two adjoining boxes high above the stage. The partition between the two boxes had been removed and decorated for the presidential visit. The display to my left included an original playbill from the performance of Our American Cousin on April 14, 1865. Once the president, first lady, and their guests made it inside the state box, the play paused while the orchestra played Hail to the Chief. The capacity crowd of 1,700 stood and applauded. When I was held out over the stage from the balcony on May 15, 2022, I had a good view of the replica chair where President Lincoln sat during the performance. Lincoln sat in a rocking chair that had been selected for him from among the Ford family's personal furnishings. From this vantage point, I had a great view of the presidential box and the entire stage below. The performance was in the third act when John Wilkes Booth entered the state box and barricaded himself inside. He waited for the right moment. At one point, Mary whispered to Lincoln, who was holding her hand, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Lincoln replied, She won't think anything about it." Those were the president's last words. Moments later, the president laughed when actor Harry Hawk recited the line, "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap." As the crowd erupted with laughter, Booth opened the door, stepped towards the president from behind, and shot him in the back of the head with his derringer. At 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth snuck into the presidential box. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, April 14th, 1865. Pointed at the back of my head is the small Philadelphia derringer used by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate President Lincoln. It's amazing how something so small could do so much damage. When Booth pulled its trigger, he changed American history forever. My photographer captured this detailed close-up image of Booth's derringer. The pistol is on permanent display in the museum at Ford's Theater. This rocking chair behind me was where Abraham Lincoln was seated when he was shot at Ford's Theater. Henry Ford purchased the chair at auction for $2,400 and it's now on display at his museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The large dark stain near the top of the chair is not blood, it's oil from people's hair when it was sat on before being preserved. However, a thorough analysis was performed on the chair and blood was discovered on the silk fabric in 2 locations. As I posed near Lincoln's rocker, it was easy to envision the president sitting in it at Ford's Theater. This is likely the most historic chair in our country. The mortally wounded president was carried from the box, through the doors behind me, and across the muddy street to the William Peterson boarding house. A stunned and angry crowd stood in the muddy street in front of Ford's Theater as the president's lifeless body was carried towards the boarding house. Soldiers carried President Lincoln out of Ford's Theater. Built in 1849, this 4-story boarding house behind me was owned by William A. Peterson in 1865. As the president was carried out of Ford's Theater into the rainy night, boarder Henry Safford directed the soldiers to take Lincoln into the boarding house. The mortally wounded president was carried up these steps and into a back bedroom of the boarding house. As I stood on the steps, it was though I could see the soldiers, with Lincoln cradled in their arms, step over me and through the door behind me. This back bedroom where I'm posing was where Abraham Lincoln spent the final hours of his life. Unfortunately, the furnishings in this room were replicas. The original bed was preserved and on display in the Chicago History Museum. President Lincoln lies dying in the Peterson boarding house, April 15th, 1865. President Abraham Lincoln died in this room at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865 at the age of 56. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son, was present at the time of his father's death. At the moment Lincoln took his last breath, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said at his bedside, "Now he belongs to the ages." On February 5th, 2022, I visited the Chicago History Museum and saw the deathbed of Abraham Lincoln. I admit, it was an emotional moment for me. Behind me is the bed where President Lincoln was laying when he died. During his final moments, Lincoln's face became calm and his breathing grew quieter. At 7:22 a.m., his breathing stopped completely. The president was dead. John Hay, Lincoln's personal assistant, said, "A look of unspeakable peace came upon his worn features." This blood-stained pillow was one used to rest the president's head during the final hours of his life. President's blood-stained pillow. Following his death, Lincoln's body was placed in a flag-wrapped coffin, which was loaded into a hearse and escorted to the executive mansion by Union soldiers. The entire nation fell into a darkened state of mourning when word of Lincoln's death circulated. Former Confederate President Jefferson Davis said of the assassination, "Next to the destruction of the Confederacy, the death of Abraham Lincoln was the darkest day the South has ever known." On April 18th, Lincoln's flag-draped casket was brought to the East Room of the White House, where the president laid in state. The following day, a funeral service was conducted in the East Room before the casket was transported to the United States Capitol. The president's funeral service in the East Room, April 19th, 1865. On April 19th, 1865, the casket containing the remains of President Lincoln arrived at the United States Capitol building, where it was placed on a specially designed catapult in the center of the rotunda. I'm standing in the center of the rotunda in the United States Capitol building, where Lincoln's casket was positioned from April 19th through the 21st. At 7 a.m. on Friday, April 21st, 1865, Lincoln's coffin was taken by honor guard from the Capitol to the train depot for the long journey back to Springfield. At least 10,000 spectators watched as Lincoln's funeral train left the Washington depot at 8 a.m. This was the catafalque used to support the coffin of President Abraham Lincoln while he laid in state in the Capitol. On April 24th, 1865, the president's remains arrived in New York City, where they were escorted to the City Hall building. President Lincoln's casket arrives at New York City Hall, April 24th, 1865. During the 24 hours Lincoln laid in state here, an estimated 125,000 people filed past to pay their respects to the fallen president. The president lying in state at City Hall in New York City. I'm standing on the spot where Lincoln's casket was positioned in New York City. Mourners walked up the stairs and past the coffin to pay their respects. The only known photo of President Lincoln lying in state. At 7:30 a.m. on April 29, 1865, the casket containing the body of President Lincoln arrived at the State House in Columbus, Ohio, where it laid in state for 9 hours. I'm standing in the center of the rotunda where Lincoln's casket was positioned. The flag on the wall behind me flew over the State House that day. I'm standing above a lock of Lincoln's hair that I found on display inside the State House. Turned out the president's brother-in-law, Ninian W. Edwards, clipped the hair on April 19, 1865, as Lincoln lay in state in the East Room. This was about as physically close to President Lincoln as I've ever been. At 9 a.m. on May 3, 1865, the Chicago and Alton Railroad engine number 58 arrived at this station. The train was carrying the remains of President Lincoln and his son Willie. I'm standing on a small monument dedicated to Abraham Lincoln that was located at the site where the president's body returned to Springfield after the assassination. I stood on the marble block with my back facing the sculpted book and looked towards the nearby tracks. I thought about how sad that day must have been 149 years earlier when Lincoln's casket had arrived following a 13-day train ride from Washington. Lincoln's funeral train. Lincoln's casket was taken from the train station to the state capitol where the martyred president laid in state for 24 hours. The ornate casket was positioned in front of Washington's portrait in the House chamber where the public got their final view of the fallen president. A final salute to Lincoln in the Illinois Capitol. At 10 a.m. on May 4, 1865, Lincoln's coffin left the Capitol for the short ride to Oak Ridge Cemetery for interment. This is the entrance to Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. When Lincoln's casket passed through the entrance, it was taken to the receiving vault. The casket of Abraham Lincoln, along with the remains of his son Willie, arrived at this receiving vault at 1 p.m. on May 4, 1865. The president arrived at Oak Ridge Cemetery. The president's remains, along with those of his son Willie, remained in the vault until December 21, 1865. From the iron gate, I had a good look at the empty receiving vault where Lincoln was entombed for roughly 7 months. For nearly 6 years, while the Lincoln tomb was being built, the caskets of the president and his sons Willie and Eddie were held in a temporary above-ground tomb marked by this simple stone. I'm standing in front of Lincoln's tomb in Oak Ridge Cemetery. Tad Lincoln had died on July 15, 1871, and was the first to be interred in the tomb. The president and his sons Eddie and Willie were interred in the tomb 2 months later on September 19, 1871. Shortly after the president's widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, died on July 16, 1882, she was entombed alongside her three sons. I'm in the burial chamber inside Lincoln's tomb. This red granite monument marks the final resting place of our 16th president. From my position on top of the marker, I had a great view of the crypts where Mary Todd, Willie, Eddie, and Tad were entombed in the opposite wall. I've visited all of the presidential grave sites in the country, and Lincoln's is my third favorite behind Garfield and JFK. I'm posing in the burial chamber next to the crypts of Abraham Lincoln's family. The Lincoln Memorial was dedicated on May 30th, 1922, with the president's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, in attendance. The statue of Lincoln was created by sculptor Daniel Chester French. It weighs 175 tons and is 19 feet tall from head to foot. If the statue of Lincoln was depicted standing, it would be 28 feet tall. The Lincoln Memorial at dusk, May 21st, 2021. This symbol of American freedom, Mount Rushmore, was created by sculptor Gutzon Borglum and 400 workers from October 4th, 1927 to October 31st, 1941. The 60-foot tall sculpted face of Abraham Lincoln was dedicated on September 17th, 1937. Lincoln was chosen for Mount Rushmore because he symbolized the preservation of the United States during the Civil War. I'm standing at the feet of the Abraham Lincoln statue in front of the Illinois State Capitol building. This statue was created by Andrew O'Connor in 1919 and symbolizes the president-elect in 1861 when he left Springfield for the final time. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield featured a 31-foot tall figurine of President Lincoln near the entrance. In the museum, I stood alongside lifelike figures of the Lincoln family in front of the White House. Standing with the President and First Lady were sons Tad, Robert, and Willie, as seen from left to right. The Lincoln Monument, which was located near the west entrance to the Nebraska State Capitol building, was unveiled on September 2nd, 1912. The Lincoln Monument behind me was dedicated in 1959 to commemorate Abraham Lincoln's 150th birthday. Today, this monument is located at the Summit Rest Area along I-80, about 10 miles east of Laramie. The Lincoln Monument is a 12.5-foot tall bust of Abraham Lincoln created by Robert Russin, resting on a 30-foot tall granite pedestal. This bronze likeness in front of the West Virginia State Capitol was named Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight and represented the president's trials and tribulations during the Civil War when West Virginia gained statehood. Surprise! There will be a third episode, but that show will focus on Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, and what's believed to have transpired during the 12 days that followed the events at Ford's Theater. You'll be taken on a photographic journey in the footsteps of America's most famous murderer, John Wilkes Booth. Trust me, it'll be a show you won't want to miss. Please do Jefferson and me a favor and subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. So long.